Hey Lobos, hey Orcas, and hey Panthers if you're watching this. This is a video we are going to be using to talk about the differences and the similarities between costs and benefits for both Native Americans and pioneers as they traveled west during the movement west. Now, in social studies, we've been talking about the Oregon Trail, which is what the pioneers took to get to the west. And then we also talked about different treaties that happened between the governor and different Native American tribes, and how that meant they had reservations created for them and where they had to move as well. So, we're going to take a look at the costs and the benefits, the good and the bad, or the bad and the good. Costs are bad, benefits are good. The bad sides and the good sides for both groups of the pioneers coming west, how it helped the pioneers, how it hurt the pioneers, and how it helped the Native Americans and how it hurt the Native Americans. So let's go ahead and get started. So the very first thing we're going to talk about is the costs for both groups. Now, both groups had different costs that were involved with the pioneers coming west. So to start off with, the pioneers, their costs, one cost was they faced a lot of disease. And they faced, of course, diseases, sickness. And there were a lot of deaths because of it. A lot of the deaths were on the trail, on the way west. So there was measles, there was dysentery, there were other diseases as well, and all of those came along while they were traveling west. Now, another cost for pioneers, they had to face disease, they had to face sickness, they had to face deaths, but also when they went west, they had to pretty much leave almost all that they had. They had to leave it behind, and they couldn't take it with them because they could only fit so much in their covered wagon. So, a cost of traveling west for them was they had to leave most belongings behind. Not only did they have to leave most belongings behind, but as they traveled, they had to walk miles. Not just 1 mile, not just 2 miles, but they had to walk almost, sometimes there was even up to 15 miles, all in one day. Then, not only that, but once they got to the Northwest, they weren't done working. They still had a lot of work they had to do. So they had to work hard on farms once they got there. And finally, not only did pioneers have to leave most of their things behind, they also had to leave a lot of family and friends behind. They might have taken their sons and daughters, or their husband, or their wife, or their those kinds of family, immediate family members, but they may not have taken their neighbors. They may not have taken their grandma or their grandpa or whoever. They definitely had to leave some family behind, and they didn't get to see them right away again. So, one other cost is leaving behind family members. And they had to leave behind some friends too. So when they did that, they had to start all over again. And not only were they starting over, but they were starting all over, far from home. These costs could definitely make it hard for the pioneers to make it all the way there. Now we're going to talk about the costs for the Native Americans. And you'll notice that on this line here, we have some different things written down. We're going to compare the two groups. So we're going to say how they were like, what was similar, how one was similar to another, or how they're the same, or what both had. But then we're also going to contrast them, which means we're going to see how are they different. So we might say the Native Americans had something that's different. However, the pioneers did something else. Or you could say, in contrast, the pioneers, whatever it might be. So let's take a look and see about those costs for the Native Americans. And we'll see how we can relate those to the costs the pioneers faced. So the pioneers had to face sickness and disease and death. Also, similarly, the Native Americans also faced disease and death. Most of the time, that sickness came from the pioneers that came along, or even the missionaries that came along. They may have brought measles with them. If you remember reading about the Whitman mission, there were some of the settlers and some pioneers that came, and they weren't purposely doing it, but they brought measles along with them. So then the Native Americans caught the measles and they got sick, and some of those died as well. So they definitely had to deal with sickness and death as well. And with that death, not only was there death from sickness, there was also death sometimes from war. Because if you remember, there were different wars that were going on as well, over land, over who would claim gold on the reservation land, all sorts of different things. So cost is losing family. You either lost them to disease because they died from a disease, or you lost them because they were in the war and got killed in the war. Then, another cost for the Native Americans, the bad side of things for them, is that their land was stolen from them. Sometimes, for example, when the gold was found, often settlers and miners just came and tried to claim the land and say, this is gold, this is ours, and they would just come onto their land. And sometimes with the reservations, they didn't have a choice. They had to go. And so in a way, it was like their land was stolen for other purposes as well. Now, sometimes even Native Americans would become slaves. And they would have to work for the pioneers on their farms. And beyond that, they were forced sometimes to move to the reservations. And not only that, but when there were settlers and pioneers, missionaries, all of those people that came, when they came to the Native Americans, often there was this feeling from them that the Native American cultures and their beliefs were not right, or they weren't good enough. So they were often being told that your culture, meaning their culture, and beliefs were not good enough. So I'm going to stop this video at this moment because this is already a lot of information. And I'm going to do another video where we go over the benefits and how we can see the benefits that each group had from the settlers and pioneers moving west and coming to the Northwest. So before we do that, though, I want you to take a look at the costs that each had. I want you to think, how are they alike? How are they the same? What makes them the same? Are there any costs that are the same, or are they all different? And if there's any differences, what are those differences? So, for example, the Native Americans and the pioneers or the settlers were similar to each other because both groups faced sickness and death. However, in contrast, the Native Americans sometimes became slaves, while the pioneers had to work hard on farms, but it was their own land instead of it being someone else's land. So take a look at this. I'm going to leave this here. This will be still on the screen for you to look at. You can always pause this video to look at it as well. Try to see what is the same, what is different between the two groups. So we'll leave this with this. In a little bit, you'll see another video where we talk about the benefits for both sides. We'll see you guys later.